Hello, everybody. I'm Graham Walker. I'm coming to you from the Independent Institute in Oakland, California. We are a public policy research and educational organization here in Northern California, and we are delighted also to be an active contributor to the ThinkSpot community. Thanks a lot, ThinkSpot, and thanks for all the people who are joining us from around the country, and I think even maybe overseas. So we're delighted to be part of the ThinkSpot world. Today, we are joined together to talk about some really pressing public policy issues here in California with a couple of our experts. First, let me introduce David Theroux, who is the founder and president of the Independent Institute. Welcome, David.
Hello.
Glad you're with us. Also with him is Dr. Williamson Evers. Dr. Bill Evers is a senior fellow here at the Independent Institute, and he is also the director of our Center on Educational Excellence with a wide portfolio of expertise. Thanks for joining us, Bill Evers.
Thank you for having me.
So, okay, the reason we're here today is because Independent Institute, not too long ago, you can maybe fill in some of the details, created this open letter, which has been signed by 151 California-based economists and political scientists calling for the suspension of a piece of legislation called AB-5. So this open letter has been getting a lot of attention. What does the open letter call for in brief, Bill Evers, and why is it getting so much attention?
Well, AB-5 was passed in 2019 and signed by the Governor Newsom, and it regulates independent contractors, so freelancers. And these political scientists and economists are concerned that it puts the independent contractors in a bind, companies that might be using their services in a bind, and particularly in this time of coronavirus, it puts the whole society, especially people who are forced to stay at home, in a terrible bind.
Yeah, it really does. So we're calling for its suspension. And in fact, there's a lot of interest in this. I just noticed that we have someone named R.H. Monroe who's joined us on this ThinkSpot program, and he's already said he's a freelancer and is very interested in the subject. So before we get into some of the problems caused by AB-5, I think a lot of people who are not specialists, like me, I'm not a specialist, what exactly did AB-5 do, and what was the idea behind it? Maybe Bill can start out and David can kind of fill in on that.
So because of various welfare state regulations, things like workman's compensation, have divided people between people who are employees of companies on a regular basis, full-time employees, and people who are independent contractors, who are like independent entrepreneurs who make some kind of deal with the company to do something, to provide a service. And so what this did was it grabbed a lot of people who were enjoying the flexibility and independence of being independent contractors and said, you have to be part of a big company. And so the individual that you mentioned, who's a freelancer of some sort, perhaps a freelance writer, if that individual writes over a certain number of articles for the Sacramento Bee or the Los Angeles Times, the Sacramento Bee, who is only maybe using 35 articles a year from this person, has to suddenly now take them on full time, have them check into work, have them be on the health plan, pay certain taxes and so forth on them, and they probably are going to be in the union.
Or I think they have to drop down to a much smaller number of articles, unless they hit that threshold, and then they're in trouble if they exceed that threshold. So the Sacramento Bee doesn't want to hire them on anymore to write stuff.
Right. So they obviously enjoyed this independence. Perhaps they could be writing for both the Sacramento Bee and the Los Angeles Times and the San Francisco Chronicle and the San Jose Mercury. But if they're sucked into being an employee of one of them, they no longer have that independence anymore. So that kind of thing applies in all sorts of areas. In our particular case, it applies to delivery people.
Yeah, exactly. And the idea being that to keep them, I guess, from being overworked somehow, they're being forced to be made employees or to not deliver so much or not drive so much or whatever. Have I got that right?
Well, it's kind of peculiar. I mean, in my area in Southern California, groceries are delivered by a company called Pavilions, and it's part of the Safeway, Vons,
Oh yeah,
Pavilions,
right, right.
Albertsons thing. And so they allow, so for people who are older, people who are infirm, people who have uh, lung problems of some sort, people who have uh, diabetes, they need to have delivery. So Pavilions has DoorDash do it. So
Oh,
DoorDash,
okay, yeah.
Postmates, Grubhub, these are delivery companies.
Hmm.
So according to this law, what they're doing is really illegal. Safeway should have to hire all these DoorDash people and have them become regular employees, like grocery clerks, like people who stack the shelves and so forth.
Right. So
Well,
this stops them from being employed so much because I guess otherwise they would be mistreated or something. That must have been the idea.
well, the idea is that somehow these independent entrepreneurial types who want to do this and be flexible and be independent don't have enough standing somehow against a big
Ah,
company.
hmm.
But this really is not how the market works, not how the job market works. Actually, every company has to consider whether an employee adds productivity to the product or service that that company is selling. And if they do, and it makes sense to have them as on a regular basis there under the supervision, they will do it that way. If but maybe the person himself doesn't want or herself doesn't want to work that way. They like setting their own hours. They like setting their own course of contract.
So just going back to kind of to the enactment of this thing last year, as I recall, and I guess this is just logical, Assembly Bill 5 garnered a majority of legislative votes in both houses and was signed by Governor Newsom. I think the former Governor Brown favored this legislation too, if I'm not mistaken. But turning to David Theroux for a minute, what were the politics behind this? What were the aims that people sought? I mean, obviously California is kind of a one-party state in Sacramento, um, and I assume that it was strongly supported by the Democratic Party. What was behind the enactment, David?
Well, part of the impetus was there was a court case that ruled, I think erroneously, that these kinds of jobs would be classified in three categories, but it was confusing. So the idea was that legislature would clarify this confusion, but they took the opportunity to go far further.
Mm-hmm.
And the reality of it is AB-5, which stands for Assembly Bill 5, pertains to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of professions. So we're talking about caterers, singers, dancers, occupational therapists, physical trainers,
Registered nurses of various sorts.
I mean, it's
Yeah,
the
right.
list is just unbelievable. Occupational therapists, I mentioned, comedians, composers, florists, paralegals. I mean, it goes on and on. And so the impact of this on people, even without the COVID-19 crisis, is huge to disrupt and eliminate those job opportunities for people. What if a woman has two children and she wants to work part-time as a contractor, as a CPA, say? She can't do that.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's an incredibly difficult. So now you add the coronavirus crisis, people are sheltering at home. They can't go to work. Maybe they've been furloughed. What do? Well,
Their
they're
options
in a
are
terrible
limited.
situation. Many of them want to have some sort of work to make ends meet.
Right.
And as Bill is pointing out, there's a great need for delivery services and many other things that people need to function with. And so
Could
I think the motivation
Yeah.
was understandable from some people, I think, but no one foresaw this pandemic.
Well, you know, on the
I think the pandemic has brought into high relief the real fallacy of the idea
right.
of a systematic blanket approach to employment in such an erroneous and horrible way that it's really undermining the lives of millions of people just in California.
We'll come back to that in a minute, but I'm still sort of thinking back to the enactment part. You know, for every major piece of legislation, there are always sort of the official justifications on the one hand, and then there's also the interests or the motives behind it. Let's just talk for a second. I don't know which of you is best to answer this, but what were sort of the official justifications for it? I mean, what were the alleged good aims that it was supposed to advance?
The alleged good aim was that it was supposed to have a backup to this lone standing individual in the face of big organizations that they were contracting with.
To protect the little guy, right?
Yeah, but you'll notice that lawyers exempted themselves.
Oh, that's interesting.
That's right.
All right, so somebody knew what they were doing.
So the official thing is to protect vulnerable workers. That was sort of the official justification. But then what you say lawyers exempted themselves, that's suspicious, but who else profited? Let's turn to David for this, I suppose. Who else profited from this legislation in a kind of a under the table sort of way or an unofficial sort of way?
Well, doctors were exempted, lawyers were exempted, real estate brokers were exempt. No, I'm sorry, insurance brokers were exempted. And what's happened is that a lot of people like musicians and others have been so outraged by this that the leadership behind AB-5 is trying to revise the measure to give other exemptions to other groups.
Which they just did. Which they just did for musicians.
Right. They want to have this consensus. So people in the music industry, they're basically trying to work out this deal. It hasn't been done yet, and I'm guessing it won't happen, but that's the idea. But again, as I said, there's so many different professions affected by this. There's no way they can catch up with this unless they just do a draconian approach, which that would alienate too many people, I think.
So
because
what
that would not make them be viewed as siding with a little guy.
What was the attitude of organized labor in California when they were working on enacting this?
Well, they were organized labor, by and large, is in favor of it because it's a way for them to reduce competition in many different areas.
Right.
And if these individuals that were being sought to be protected wanted it, they would be in favor of it, but they're not in favor because they actually benefit from being individual contractors.
Also, labor unions are big organizations and they like to interact with larger entities. They don't like an independent trucker, for example.
Right.
Truckers were originally going to be under this, but the independent truckers sued in federal court and got themselves exempted. But imagine if every independent trucker had to become part of some company that he or she was servicing.
There'd be no more independent truckers.
So that gives you an idea of, maybe the Teamsters who have trouble organizing independent truckers would view that with, they'd like that, but the independent truckers wouldn't like it. That's why they're independent.
Right.
Another group that's been affected is journalists, including photojournalists, authors, writers of all sorts.
Right.
Bill mentioned the person who writes a column, say, for the LA Times. So it really is to cartelize markets as opposed to the idea of sort of decentralized, dynamic process of individuals seeing opportunities and serving one another.
Oh, wow.
So very well stated. But there's an interesting parallel. After the Civil War was over, blacks were freed, okay? And there were different jobs. The light industries were starting in various parts of the South. Shipbuilding that had been halted during the Civil War is coming back to life. So here were these freed slaves scattered around the South. And so some people who are called immigrant agents would look for jobs and try and place blacks in these freed blacks in these jobs and get them there, advance them the money to go by railroad, and they would use a telegraph and so forth. So it was like a high-tech thing where they were helping the mobility and flexibility of labor. So the plantation owners and the white supremacist governments wanted to clamp down on this to keep the blacks on the plantations.
Yeah.
And so this is kind of similar because it's a high-tech thing. It was a telegram in those days, but now it's the internet, it's the labor mobility and flexibility. And so this is kind of an interesting historical parallel.
That's fascinating. So, you know, I'm just kind of stepping back from it again as a non-specialist. I suppose that little by little, it was dawning on Californians that so many different professions were being adversely affected. And so I guess it might have been since it was August last or September that it was signed into law. Different groups, I suppose, must have been wanting to get their group exempted because nobody wants to be put at that kind of disadvantage. So little by little, people were seeking exemptions. But how much better just to realize that the whole premise was problematic. But then how much more did that become clear when suddenly the epidemic hit the country and there's closures, everybody has to work remotely from home or they can't work or whatever. Talk a little bit about, Bill, about how the crisis stemming from the coronavirus thing has made the flaws in AB-5 even more visible to more people.
Well, instead of just whoever used to get groceries delivered in the past or drugstore deliveries or whatever, which we suddenly had a large set of people who, for medical reasons, were threatened with death if they started going out and shopping, unless they were very, very careful. And even then, they had to be worried.
So they need delivery.
So we need delivery people.
Yeah.
At the same time, the huge numbers of people who have been furloughed or laid off, perhaps temporarily, don't really know the future of the economy, but there are people who could be, they could be a handyman if you're at home and you can't do something, and they could do that, or they could, what we were talking about, a delivery person, or let's say they're a kind of registered nurse or nurse practitioner or something like that, who isn't part of a hospital or part of a clinic, but travels around on a contract basis, even across state lines, to hotspots, which we are having with this coronavirus. Well, this is outlawed essentially in California. It's caught in this horrible bureaucratic quicksand, and it's very inhumane. It's very uncompassionate toward the people who are trapped at home that might have diabetes or just old age. And it's very uncompassionate and unfair and indecent toward the people who would like to provide a service, really what's a humanitarian service, even though they're paid for it. It's something they should be paid for if that's what can be arranged. So it's just bad all around.
So under conditions of the shutdown, all sorts of sort of what we call gig activities, gig work can still be done under these conditions, but suddenly you're at risk of being penalized if you do too much of it, right?
If you get, so, you know, the government isn't necessarily cracking down on everybody who's doing this.
Well, thank goodness.
But yes, I'm not advocating that they do. But anybody who is doing it is acting under the threat that this could happen anytime.
Right.
And especially for the big companies, it's very risky for them to be doing this, but they're doing it because they're trying to help their consumers who are out there.
And David, you were giving us a list of different professions that were affected. And I was thinking beyond the delivery gigs and so forth, there's so many other gigs. I mean, if you're stuck at home and you're a writer, for instance, you could be doing more writing from home or other kinds of sort of indirect service provision, but you're under the same threat, right, David?
That's right. I mean, translators, tutors, wedding planners. I mean, the list just goes on and on. One other dimension of this is, of course, with Silicon Valley and the very robust home for startups. Someone who wants to start up a company and get some initial capital or tries to steward themselves, the way you can start a company is that you bring in expertise to help you do software or whatever that is you're trying to develop, but you're not going to have them as full-time employees. In fact, these different part-time workers might be moonlighting. So you try to ramp up the company, the startup, based on the ability for you to steward the resources that you have and make it viable. But now you have to hire everybody full-time. So there's no way you can have startups. So the garage of Hewlett and Packard,
right,
or anything close to it.
Right. I mean, the thing is, I think I heard you say, Bill Evers, once that, it's great to, have rules insisting upon certain hours and certain conditions and whatnot, but if the job itself doesn't exist, it really doesn't help you that much, right?
Yes, that's in the letter of these 151 economists and political scientists. So if we constrain the labor market and the entrepreneurial efforts that David Theroux was just describing, then we don't have anything. And maybe somebody feels good because this legislation was passed, but they ought to feel bad because what they've done has been counterproductive and destructive.
It strikes me that so many of the things that are features of the AB-5 problem illustrate one of the several ways in which government restrictions actually put us in a much more vulnerable position as a society to trying to respond to this coronavirus crisis than we would have been had these restrictions not been in place. So we were actually harmed and made less able to deal with the coronavirus because AB-5 was passed.
Right. So what do midwives do? What do music teachers do? And the list just goes on and on. So it's really a very serious problem that's going to make the recovery far more difficult, assuming that the shutdown comes to an end.
And it seems to me that we may have be right at the moment where people are realizing all across California and maybe elsewhere that the solution to this problem is not to, add 1, 2, 3, or 4, or 5, or 5.5 more exemptions to AB-5, but to suspend the whole thing to get people back on their feet. Which leads to the question that I have been asked by one of our onlookers. Is there legislation like AB-5 in other states? What's going on elsewhere? Should Californians alone be concerned about this kind of a thing? What do you think, Bill?
Well, there is already a thing in Washington State that has some similarities, but has had a lot of difficulties fully implementing it. I would say there are quite a few states that are enamored of this idea, particularly large states, urban populations, so New York, Illinois, that kind of state. But the really interesting thing is the possibility raised by Vice President Biden that he would push to have this done on a national basis.
Wow, to shackle the gig economy nationally, the very thing that has made us productive and able to be flexible and responsive would be then throttled by some kind of national version of the California law?
Yes. And the destruction of creativity. I mean, think of it. We're talking about all the professions we've already mentioned, as well as professions like cartoonists and singers and novelists. And I mean, it's endless. And so the bulk of the employment in the United States comes from people who have small businesses, which either are independent themselves or use independent contractors to exist. And virtually all large firms use independent contractors because there's no point in having full-time people if the job only requires a smaller amount, and the people who want to do the independent contracting prefer it that way.
It gives you
flexibility. Who are full-time independent contractors and they have 30 clients.
Right. So take the case of P.J. Woodhouse, the famous comic writer.
Yes.
When he was first starting out, he wrote for a New York newspaper a column once every 2 weeks. If they were going to keep him on, they had, under these sorts of conditions, they would have had to make him a full. Well, he wasn't good for that. he wasn't an obituary writer or a sports writer or a news writer. He was this one particular kind of comic writer, a writer about theater and things like that. And they didn't want to fill the pages every day with that. They just wanted an independent contract with him to do that one thing. This is running against some of the most wonderful creativity we've seen in history.
Yeah,
So
it
I
affects
guess,
community theaters, it affects children's theaters,
mhm.
it affects, as I've mentioned, florists. I mean, it's really pretty extensive in its impact.
Let me just mention as a reminder to those who are joining in with us on this live stream that you do have the option through the ThinkSpot interface of submitting live questions, and they will get to me, and then I will pose them to David Theroux or Bill Evers. Some questions have already come in. One of our participants named Mark asks this question: are there any legal grounds to challenge AB-5 in the courts? I guess that assumes that our campaign to have it suspended is not immediately successful. Are there legal grounds that you could challenge it in the courts?
There are a number of lawsuits currently in the courts. There are 2 lawsuits at the Ninth Circuit. One is representing journalists and authors. The other one is, I believe, Uber and Postmates has the suit, and other app firms have joined in. The California Trucking Association won a statute suit based on a federal statute that affects motor carriers.
Because they're interstate commerce.
Right.
Yeah.
And there's talk of others. There's some others that I don't know much about, but I think that the recourse that people are making is they're trying to find a way to either get themselves exempted, to stop the effect of this, either to them as an industry or profession or overall. There are groups that are talking about protesting. I mean, it's letter writing. I mean, it's all, they're thinking about targeting policymakers who will not bend in the upcoming election. The open letter that we put together with the economists and political scientists was from about 40 colleges and universities and think tanks in California, representing large and small, very prominent institutions and prominent scholars. So this is no trivial matter, and it's not a partisan matter. It's really a matter of good sense and common decency.
So delivery people are both Republicans and Democrats and independents and other parties. So yes, this is.
So are you telling us that 151 signatories are not all just to one party?
Many of them have no party.
Yeah.
I would say most of them probably.
So I would just say to those watching and listening, thinking about the subject, if you're from elsewhere, you should be rooting for Californians who are trying to recover their freedom to make money in California under these adverse conditions, and watch out for something similar. It could be coming to a state near you, if not worse. But I mean, the state legislature in California could simply suspend or even rescind the thing, could they not? I mean, there's no reason why they couldn't, except their own disinclination.
They could, and the governor has shown some flexibility when it comes to the medical workforce. He has said medical students, nursing students, you may not have your license yet, but come help us. We need you. On the other hand, when it comes to this, he says he's proud of it and he's not backing down.
Wow.
So he's possibly more flexible in the legislature. So that would certainly be a person to concentrate on.
David, you had a comment there.
In the instance of the healthcare workers that Bill just mentioned, once that was announced, 25,000 people applied for these positions in one day. So why would we be against considering all the needs people have without a coronavirus crisis?
Right.
With it, why would we not want thousands and thousands of people to come forward and offer to serve other people in innovative ways?
I guess the answer to that must be sort of theoretically, going back to the rationale behind the enactment of AB-5, we don't want those people to step forward and earn money and help others because they might become exploited workers of some kind. I guess we don't want them to be exploited.
But here's the interesting thing. So in the Middle Ages, they had the Black Death, they had bubonic plague, and so working conditions changed, and people that were serfs wanted to go to places where there was work, and the government authorities passed a law that forbade people to pay them more or forbade them to leave, and it said you had to pay the same amount it was paid before the plague came and things like that. So here you have another case where they're trying to freeze the market for work, where the actual workers, are looking for flexibility. And there's a big effect, because in Western Europe, where they broke the bonds of this, and free workforce became the engine of development for the whole world, and it's still the center of strong economies. Eastern Europe, where they kept it inflexible, is still way behind. Centuries later, is still way behind Western Europe, Northwestern Europe.
Mm-hmm.
So in England, they rebelled against Richard II, and almost Wat Tyler's rebellion was a rebellion of the masses who wanted to have work flexibility, and they eventually got it. But there is a desire of working people to have independence and flexibility.
Send me your teeming masses yearning to breathe free. And in California, we have teeming masses who are yearning to make some money under these conditions. And, either they can't do it, or they try, or they're under threat of punishment because of this legislation. Hard to believe. So here's a question that one of our observers has handed me. Would suspending AB-5 lead to a reduction in wages?
The reason why people want to work independently is because they can have a better life. They can make more money, they can have independence, they can have flexibility, they can have the sense of accomplishment, serving other people or their own crafts ability. So to deny people that is to deny human agency. And so the record actually for a market in which people are free to choose their own course to work, people overwhelmingly make more money, they have more satisfaction, they have a higher standard of living, lower child mortality, and every other measurement improves.
So in addition, I think you should conceptually think of your wages as not just your money wages, but also your working conditions. That's something that you are getting from your employer, and it's something that you are getting some satisfaction out of. So people who want to have independence and flexibility are taking that as part of their package of their wage. So they're actually losing wages by losing the chance to be their own the captain of their own life.
In simple terms, of course, right now, there are lots of people, many, hundreds of thousands, if not millions in California, who are stuck, can't get out to work, and would love to, take on a few gigs. But if they take on too many gigs so they can make more money, they're going to be punished. So actually, if you're making no money and you could get a few gigs to make some money, your wages would go up if we could suspend AB-5. That's pretty straightforward calculus. Hey, I see I've got a question coming in from one of our ThinkSpot participants who's currently with us. Question says, is there any way of calculating the number of Californians who have lost work due to AB-5, the value of that work in dollars, or maybe the total tax dollars lost to the state, which they could have assessed on work that could have been done absent AB-5? That sounds like a hard question to answer.
It is, but there are people who are interested in looking into it. The situation is that in the last 6 weeks, 3 million people in California have applied for unemployment benefits, and $6 billion have been paid out. So this group of 3 million includes a lot of people who have been furloughed in the last 6 weeks and can't get these gig jobs.
Right.
So clearly they're going to be better off if they have the choice and the opportunity to improve themselves without AB-5 blocking their ability to do so. So again, the lockdown is brought the ability to produce wealth and well-being in society to a halt in many respects. But people are anxious to get back to work. Why not let them do that, at least through this gig working, by not having AB-5 shut them down?
Getting income from paying clients during the shutdown just seems to me a whole lot better than not getting any income during the shutdown.
That's right.
So one of our research associates here at the Independent Institute has given me some data saying that there's a survey of independent contractors conducted by the Bureau of Labor Standards, reporting that 80% of independent contractors prefer their status relative to that of a regular W-2 employee.
Yeah.
But should employees have a say in how they are classified?
I mean, that could be part of the work agreement, but why does it have to be that? I mean, is a handyman a plumber or a bricklayer, or
right.
And if, especially in the tech world, the development of new kinds of professions happens weekly, if not daily, as far as new innovations, and with all the kinds of innovations as far as app services. And in the last 5 years, we've all benefited from that. If AB-5 had been passed 10 years ago, the great bulk of that couldn't have happened.
That's for sure. So we have, here's another current question from Petra, who's asking, this is kind of an inflammatory question, but we may not be able to give you a full answer to your question, Petra, but Petra's question is, how do we sue the state?
Well, these people that have already made these lawsuits are working on this, and if you're a person with technical knowledge, maybe you can contribute to giving them information, or giving information to someone who's doing an amicus brief, which means a contribution to the case, where somebody who isn't one of the original plaintiffs comes in with a thoughtful additional argument.
You know, people, I think, who are listening in with us now and just keeping up with this issue, they're probably all thinking, what can I do? I know that must be what Petra was thinking. What can I do? And I think the answer to that is that, first of all, you need to keep yourself well informed. One of the reasons why we're doing this broadcast today and why we're doing research and publication on the subject is because the Independent Institute is trying to be a source of information and, background, so that citizens can know what's really going on, what works, what doesn't work, and what the options are. If you want to do something, and of course we all feel kind of a need to do something under these conditions, first of all, you need to be well informed, and we invite you to turn to the Independent Institute for the resources that we have available. And in addition to that, they can talk to their fellow citizens, and I guess, Bill, can they talk to their legislators?
Absolutely, and particularly if the legislator is worried about being reelected.
That's a good point.
But, the governor aspires to be president someday. He has a business background, and he might be amenable to sensible arguments.
Yeah, he may well be. I mean, what's interesting about this crisis throughout the nation, and certainly here in California, is that under these pressures, sometimes the things that are hard to see and less obvious become much more crystal clear. And I think the downsides of AB-5 are one of those things. We're suddenly waking up and saying, oh my gosh, we put ourselves in a much worse position in the face of this crisis than we ever needed to be.
I think what Graham is getting at is something that we should have an optimistic attitude toward. And that is, if the public clearly doesn't like this law, the legislators will change it.
That's right.
If the public shows strong enough intensity, passion, that this is a destructive thing, it's an inhumane thing, it's an indecent thing to be blocking these people from getting work and blocking the stay-at-home, infirm, elderly people from getting these deliveries and things like that. The legislators will change. They're there. They want to stay in office, and if the public has a strong view, they will change.
I mentioned
We
that
would suggest that they go to independent.org and look at the open letter itself. And there are other resources there that they can pursue. And then from there, basically get involved with the work that Independent does, but also get involved on the local level with your families and communities and policymakers in your districts and so forth. This is not a difficult thing to deal with, but people need to be informed and have, as Bill was saying, the sense that you can make a difference because you can.
Indeed, and I'm thinking also that the Independent Institute has long been a source of sort of insight and analysis on these kinds of issues. Today, very simply, one of the things that we aim to do is to help California citizens and others understand that there's more to be said than just, oh, we want to protect workers from big bad employers. The reality is more complex. And in fact, as we have discovered now, that the claim that these restrictions help workers is not true. It has all sorts of unintended consequences that have harmed workers, will continue to harm workers financially, and also curtail their simple moral right to decide how they want to conduct their economic life. For all these reasons, you actually can mount a good argument against these kind of labor laws. Independent has also published work about this kind of thing in the past. David Theroux, I'm noticing in the background, you've got that one of our books, Out of Work. I've got a copy of it here with me, Unemployment and Government in 20th Century America. This is a book which is not about AB-5, but it's kind of the background of which AB-5 is an instance. There is evidence that the major cause of unemployment in the United States in many cycles has been government regulation itself. Sometimes regulation for the sake of promoting workers has produced unemployment. You want to give us a quick call out for this book, so in case our participants want to take a look?
Sure, it's a book by two economists. It's very readable. It's basically a history of the 20th century of the issue of employment and unemployment and all the government measures that have existed that affect that, including ones that were intended to improve employment. The book was actually, it's interesting because the book was endorsed both by Milton Friedman and Robert Reich.
That's unusual.
Yes, and so the book basically shows that the bulk of these measures, which AB-5 would be one, the history of these measures are to create unemployment and to hold back people from improving their lives, despite the best intentions of people.
Yeah, despite the best
intentions. People need to be free to choose to improve their own lives and overcome their own problems. It stands to reason if you have problems and you're not allowed to make choices to go overcome the problems are going to persist probably. So it's pretty straightforward, but it's a award-winning book, and I think people would get a lot out of it. One of the authors, Richard Vedder, is one of our senior fellows, and we have a great deal of other material and videos by him also on our website.
So I invite you to visit independent.org website. You can look through our publications and our books. This book is there among many other important resources. We also have a whole webpage devoted to the COVID-19 crisis and some of the public policy consequences of it. Kind of the thread that runs through a lot of this material is that many policies that were upheld somehow to promote, protect people, promote the common good, have all sorts of unintended consequences that are exactly the opposite. And AB-5 certainly is prime among them in California. I can almost hear participants in the background with ThinkSpot rooting us on, saying, go for it, guys. And of course, we are going for it. We're trying to educate the public, but really only citizens can ultimately make the difference. And we encourage you to get yourself educated and to speak up. Any final words of encouragement from Dr. Bill Evers as we kind of bring this to a conclusion?
I think the existence of this hobbling of providing a needed service is a travesty, and the public can change this if it wills to do it. I think, one thing you have possibly is some time on your hands, and
Right.
to improve our society, here is a stellar way to do it. And the members of the state assembly, the state senate, the governor, they all know what this law is. And if they hear from you saying it should be suspended, they'll know what you're talking about.
David Theroux, you founded the Independent Institute more than 30 years ago. You've been at this for a long time. You've seen it make a difference to have an educated public, have you not?
Absolutely. Yep. And many important changes only have occurred because of that.
So, okay. Thank you both, David Theroux and Bill Evers, for what you are doing, both in the research and in the public promotion of the open letter to suspend AB-5. I invite people to take a look at that at our website, www.independent.org. Please make use of our resources. Thank you for being with us in this live stream today. Of course, we always appreciate it when people want to support our work. You can always donate to our work on our webpage because we're doing the kind of work that I think makes a difference for ordinary Californians and people around the United States. Again, thanks everybody for being with us. Thanks, David Theroux. Thanks, Bill Evers. Thank you. Thanks, Spot. Take care, everybody.
Thank you, Graham.